Greetings, people of the internet. I'm Scott with Serkworks Art Labs. Welcome to the underground laboratory where we create robots, aliens, zombies, and other imminent threats to humanity. And we do comics. We are doing comics right now because this is the 100 Days of Making Comics Challenge, where we spend 30 minutes a day, every day, working on our own personal comic book projects. This challenge is growing like crazy. A lot of new people getting involved. So if this is your first video, welcome. So yeah, that's the challenge. My comic book is this one. This is the current issue. It's called Young and the Dead. And it's a kids versus zombie story. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, that's the issue. It's at Serkworks.com, as well as two other issues. That's issue 3. Working on issue 4 right now. And just before we get started though, we're gonna do what we always do. We get the big fat Sharpie, our oversized pad of paper, and we jot down what day it is. So let's see, I think today is day 65. That's where we are. We just want to document that so we don't lose track. But today, I've been thinking about, I got this crazy idea in my head, and I try to push these ideas out as soon as they come in my head, but I had this idea for this new comic. And don't worry, I'm not abandoning Young and the Dead. This would be something, if it happens, it would be after that. So, you know, you never know when ideas are going to come in your head. So you get this idea, and I started thinking when I started Young and the Dead, and then the project I was doing before that, and you know, as I'm sitting in my bed before I go to sleep, rolling this over in my head, well, if I did do this, how would I want to format the book and everything? Would I do it similar to Young and the Dead? And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about is, for lack of a better term, formatting, or just thinking about how you're going to present your comic book. Because you ever see a movie that you watch this movie, or you've heard reviews of a movie and they say the movie just didn't know what it was. It didn't, the tone, and maybe that's a better term for what I'm talking about today, is the tone of your book. So yeah, for instance, you can do anything with comic books. You can, because they can be as outlandish, as humorous, out crazy, as realistic, whatever you want to do. But you have to establish that world. You can do whatever you want, but make sure you establish that world in the beginning, because if you break that format, then people don't buy it. I mean, people will buy the most ridiculous stuff as long as you know what your book is, and as long as you start off and you present it as such. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and also just different ways you want to present your book. Or like I'm thinking about, again, I'm old school, so I'm going to go back, way back in time when I was a kid, and talk about like album covers and things like that. So I don't know, you guys are probably familiar, have heard, if you're not fans or whatever, of Iron Maiden. Now, if you've ever seen an Iron Maiden album, it's almost like a continuous story. All their album art, it's got this sort of zombie character named Eddie, and he kind of, each album, it's a little different themed, and he may change a little bit, but it's always him. It's all kind of in that same style. It's sort of a fantasy style illustration. So you can see that and you can follow that, and you definitely, and when I was growing up, I kind of liked that idea. I mean, truth be told, I wasn't a huge Iron Maiden fan, but I always liked their album artwork. So every time a new album came out, I mean, I would look at it and I was like, oh, this is cool. So, but you knew what to expect. Now, because I don't follow Iron Maiden as a band so much, I can't really speak to how their albums differed. But there was one band that you may not have heard of. This one. This one's kind of, there's a band called Quiet Riot that came out. They were kind of like a one-hit wonder. They were the first sort of, quote, heavy metal band that kind of broke into the pop chart and everything like that. But they had this huge album called Mental Health, and it was just like this huge phenomenon. And it had this cover, and it's like, you know, it's got this guy, and he's kind of got this metal type mask on. And I mean, everyone was going crazy over this album back in the day. And people were making the mask out of tinfoil or in shop or something like that. So it was just this huge thing, and that was such a cool, iconic look. So I was like, oh, they come out with another album, I hope they have that same mask. And they did, but the thing was, that second album that came out was pretty much a carbon copy of that first album. So what I'm trying to say is, you know, when I was a kid, I kind of thought that was cool with that storytelling, and I don't want to take away from that. I do still like that, but because when I would see somebody put out an album that had kind of this cool cover, and then they come out with another album and it's totally different, maybe a totally different designer or whatever, but it took me a while to realize that they're trying to break away from what they were doing before. They don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So when I was working on this was my former project that never got finished. I talked a little bit about this. This is retrofits, and was like I said, was never finished. This is just sort of just like a pitch that I would present, because back then I was trying to like sell it to like a company like an Image or something like that. So this is sort of the pitch Bible. But as you can see in here, and I showed this before, I don't know if you can read this, but it's kind of in this funky 60s, 70s style type, and it says time keeps on slipping into the future. So that was kind of the title of this particular comic book, that issue. Like the way I formatted it, each issue would have a certain look. And I don't know if you can tell from here, but even the borders had kind of this weird rounded 60s graphic design look to it. They kind of carried through. So I was establishing a look for this. So when I started with Young and the Dead, I definitely wanted to break away from this, because that's an entirely different book. So if you've ever read Young and the Dead, or if I ever showed you, there's no title chapters or anything like that, other than on the book it says no zombies allowed, which I guess you could say is the arc of this particular story. So it starts off, I do have a little, basically, all right. So I've got kind of like a title page. So each issue kind of starts with that, but there's no fancy like lettering or anything like that to indicate where the story is. There's not even, like with the other one, I would say, you know, 1970 something is where it started, and then if you flash back, it would go into, you know, back when I wrote it was back in the 90s, so 1990 something, because it kind of flashed between those two time periods, which made a lot of sense. You want to indicate that where you are in this story and everything, especially if you're going back in time. But then again, movies don't do that. Like if you're watching like Back to the Future, they don't say 50s. There's no type on the bottom of the screen that says 1955, 1985. You just know, and you kind of know because you're following them as they go into that time. But anyway, but with Young and the Dead, I don't have any of that. There's no like little caption boxes indicating where we are in the time. It all takes place in the 80s, but I wanted it to be sort of ambiguous, because I didn't want to say this is 83 or 84 or whatever, because I didn't want to get into people analyzing so much. I wanted just to feel like the 80s. I don't want to tie it into a particular time period, because if you've ever seen that show, The Goldbergs, they started off with I think a certain date in the 80s, but then, you know, people picked it apart. Well, this wasn't invented back then or whatever. Even with like Stranger Things, when they showed the Millennium Falcon, they used the newer one that they released in the 2000s, and people caught that right away. So things like that, I don't want people to really analyze it. So I just wanted to feel like the 80s. So I didn't want to say exactly where it was or anything like that. But these are the kind of things I was thinking about when I started up this project. I definitely wanted it to differ from this other project, even though nobody saw it. You know, of course, a lot of that stuff wouldn't make sense with the kind of design aesthetic and everything, because this takes place in the 80s. That was the 70s, which, you know, depending on how late in the decade you go, kind of carries over. But anyway, so that's something you want to think about when you're creating your comic book. Think about how you're going to establish your world and kind of stick to that. Because if you just go off the rails, if you don't plan this stuff out, and again, I want to stop myself before, when I start talking about planning, I'm still of the opinion that finish is better than perfect, so don't spend too much time planning, but I guess in the beginning, do kind of think about some of this stuff. But anyway, those are my thoughts for today. I want to get back right to the comic book making process, and we'll see where we are with Young and the Dead. To do that, we're going to go right up here to this little device here called the paralleloscope, which allows us to do parallel universes, alternate realities, where another version of me is already in process in the comics, so let's go to that right now. And we're back to working on that double page spread of pages 4 and 5. Yeah, so first, usually what I do before I actually get the brush out and everything, I rule everything out. So anything with straight lines, I go ahead and get my ruler and my micron pens out, and I've got, you know, a few different sizes of those. I think I might need to get some larger size. I'll have to go back and check the previous issues, but I think like my borders, I think for those I use a pretty thick pen, so I want to make sure it kind of matches. But I mean, obviously a thicker pen, I can just go right over the thin pens here. And I'm also wondering if some of these are too thin, because when I use the brush, and I ordered some new brushes. I'll have to see when they get here, but because I ordered some of I like to use the the Winsor & Newton Series 7, and I've only had like I think a number 2 and a number 3, so I ordered a 0 and a 1 because I've been just using like the Cotman watercolor brushes, which are pretty good brushes. They're kind of economy one, but I figured I'd invest in some better brushes, and hopefully I've had the other ones for a while, but I didn't take as good a care of them as I should have probably. But anyway, so I'll have to go back and check some of the previous issues on that, but I don't want the inks to be way thicker than a lot of the lines. Some of them it's okay, like the bricks, it's okay because I don't want them to, you know, call too much attention. But anyway, I'm going to show you this restaurant. It's called, I think it's called Central Kitchen. We went there and it looked pretty cool. So I was excited to eat there. They had some live music and the menu looked really good, but when we got there it was like over an hour wait, and we had places to go, so we didn't get to eat there. So maybe we'll go back next time and gonna talk a little more about that experience. Now where we go. All right, back in the lab and wrapping up another episode. Day 65 is done. Let's pull that off the big pad of paper. We crumble it up. We toss it right in the trash. And we say goodbye to day 65. I'll see you tomorrow for day 66. That is all. Hey everyone, you've seen the process. Now you can check out the story. Issues 1 through 3 of Young and the Dead are available at my website at serkworks.com. Also follow me on social media at the links listed below. Subscribe and check out some of the other videos in the series. There's much more to come.